Well, welcome everyone to our final lecture, actually, in the series Illicit Objects in Lived Religion here at the Center for the Study of Lived Religion. I'm Joseph Sanzo, Director of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion. And I'm very excited about the lecture today by Kimberly Stratton, Was Magic a Subversive Discourse in Antiquity? Now, Kimberly Stratton is a full professor in the religion program at Carleton University in Ottawa. Her monograph, Naming the Witch, Magic, Ideology, and Stereotype in the Ancient World, received the F.W. Baer Book Award from the Canadian Society of Biblical Studies in 2008 and has become actually a classic in our field ever since. She also edited another important volume, Daughters of Hecate, Women and Magic in the Ancient World, which she co-edited with Dana Caleres. She is currently working on a series of articles and a monograph that draw insight from trauma studies in anthropology to explain the rupture between Jewish sects in response to the failed Judean revolts against Rome. Her research, which ranges widely, avidly engages with theoretical approaches to understand history and integrate its scholarly reproduction. So, Kim, without further ado, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Just going to remind people it's sort of early morning where I am, so I've got my tea and sort of got the kids out the door to school, but still waking up here. So I want to thank Professor Joseph Sanzo and Dr. Piera Tallon and everyone involved in the Center for Lived Religion at Ca' Foscata University for inviting me to give this talk as part of the Illicit Objects, Lived Religion, Materiality, Performance, and Power lecture series. Just an aside, I told my kids I was giving a talk in Venice, and they were very excited because they thought that meant we were going on another trip. I said, no, on Zoom today. So the invitation to deliver a talk on illicit objects opened an opportunity for me to revisit a paper I gave almost 20 years ago at the University of Chicago entitled Ritual Inversion and Social Subversion, Magic Discourse in Antiquity, in which I proposed that the practice of certain rituals, specifically katadesmoi and defixiones, participated in the larger operation of magic discourse, except that by embracing alterity and negative stereotypes, these rituals engaged in a form of subversive discourse, challenging the status quo. This proposition was the flip side or follow-up to my, at that time, recently published book, Naming the Witch, in which I argued that magic should not be understood as an objective set of practices, as many scholars were arguing at the time, nor merely an outsider accusation, but as a discourse of alterity that constructed ideas about legitimate and illegitimate access to power, part and parcel of enforcing social hierarchies in behavioral constraints. The paper I gave logically extended the application of Foucault's theory of discourse from accusations and stereotypes of magic, which were the primary subject of my book, to the practice of rituals that conformed to ancient and modern conceptions of magic. In other words, I was following Foucault's insight that discourse is more than a top-down imposition of knowledge and power. It is a mutual configuration of power through participation at all levels of society. Those subjected to power internalize the systems of knowledge that define and delimit it, actively co-producing and reinforcing the knowledge-power nexus that lies at the heart of the very discourse that marginalizes them. The talk I gave was roundly rejected, as eminent scholars such as Christopher Farone argued that aspects of ritual inversion I had identified, such as binding, cursing, appealing to chthonic deities and the restless dead, and invoking harm on others, belonged rather on the continuum of Greek religion, and rejected the proposal that anyone conceived of their own ritual practices as magic anyway. As a newly minted PhD, whose first book was published only 2 months prior, and without tenure, I quietly filed away this idea and stood down. 20 years later, with more wisdom and job security, I want to revisit this idea and bring it into conversation with recent developments in the field of ancient magic. Let's start with the term magic, which appears in the title of this talk. Many scholars continue to use magic ethically, as Esther Idenau explains, quote, to denote a specific category of ritual practice in which supernatural forces were somehow employed, be that harnessed, cajoled, and persuaded, or forced by one person to attack another, unquote. So by including the verb persuade alongside harness, cajole, and force, this definition avoids the Fraserian distinction between magic as an act that compels the gods and religion which supplicates them. It also centers the element of violence and harm, which distinguishes curses and binding spells from other types of ritual, like amulets or healing charms, that frequently get caught in the dragnet of modern definitions of magic, even though these technologies would not have been considered magic by most ancients. Increasingly, however, scholars eschew magic as a second-order term altogether in favor of other analytical categories, such as lived religion. David Frankfurter uses ritual expert to refer to producers of rituals that are most often classified as magic. And Laura Nasrallah's recent book, Ancient Christians and the Power of Curses, eschews the word magic throughout, preferring the more descriptive language of defixiones and katadesmoi to describe the rituals she investigates. In a forthcoming book, Beyond Magic in the Roman World, Andrew Durden returns to J.Z. Smith's rejection of the category magic altogether. He asks, what conceptual infrastructure allows us to treat chanting, cursing, and amulet wearing as aspects of the same thing? The category magic is fragmented, but still held together, he argues, by tacit definitions, folk beliefs, and a priori assumptions. Magic is no longer defined, he states, it is recognized, and that recognition depends on assumptions that often go unstated. Discussing material evidence for certain rituals classified as magic, Durden writes, magic is assumed to be a stable object out there in the world, and material sources, especially those that appear unmediated or didactic, are imagined to bring us closest to it. The very instability of the category, acknowledged at the level of theory, is quietly compensated for by the solidity of the artifact. If magic cannot be securely defined, it can at least be found, engraved in lead, inked on papyrus, etched in stone. Durden instead focuses on the production of alterity in specific Roman writings, highlighting specific contexts and difference over similarity, thus distinguishing his approach from my conception of magic discourse, which he argues reifies magic as a unified system, even as it tries to avoid treating magic as a discrete set of practices. Notwithstanding Andrew Durden's analytically sharp critique and significant contribution to the discussion, I continue to find heuristic utility in the notion of magic discourse to describe a widely held perception of certain ritual activities designated by a constellation of overlapping terms such as mageia, goetia, pharmakeia, and katadesmoi, among others, and stereotypes about people who do them, that is, the rituals, to describe the ideological work of literary stereotypes, accusations, fears, and responses to fear, as well as the practice of such rituals. In other words, it's a whole constellation of literary depictions, stereotypes, terms, name-calling, as well as this practice. So magic discourse centers on the notion of alterity and identifies the processes involved in reifying ideas about normative versus illegitimate or illicit ritual practices. The question I entertain today is whether certain types of rituals participate in magic discourse. Do they construct themselves as other, or draw on notions of alterity that suggest they were aware of and harness negative stereotypes and conceptions of magic? And if so, what does that suggest about social location and the relationship to power and social hierarchy that was expressed and reinforced by normative Roman rituals? I guess the broader question I bring to this community of experts who specialize in carefully detailed studies of material evidence for lived religion is whether a theoretical rubric or heuristic is useful at all for understanding these texts. Much of what I argue converges with previous analyses and interpretations, but I propose that these rituals illuminate both the constitutive features of the practices themselves and the broader nexus of literature, law, and social power within which they were formulated, defined, and made possible. Central to my analysis of alterity and subversive discourse is the ritual theory of Catherine Bell. In a fascinating and insightful article that buttresses the concept of magic discourse, Esther Idenau engages Catherine Bell's theory of ritualization to argue for the agency of victims of magic. Focusing on Libanius's 4th century account of a magical attack, Idenau argues that attributing his ills to magic, discovering and removing a mutilated chameleon as the cause of his affliction, and requesting prayers on his behalf, Libanius engages in ritual actions that participated in the social construction of magic belief. Magic belief is her term. I would use magic discourse. Drawing on Catherine Bell's explanation of ritualization, quote, as a way of acting that specifically establishes a privileged contrast, differentiating itself as more important and powerful, unquote, Idenau describes how Libanius not only employed shared knowledge of institutional structures, but also created them. And, as Bell describes, he both drew on relationships of power and helped to generate them. Idenau's engagement with Catherine Bell's ritual theory provides an illuminating and highly original interpretation of Libanius's experience of magical attack. She recuperates his agency through participation in the construction of belief in magic. Bell's explanation of ritualization provides even more fertile ground for considering the ritual logic of curses themselves and helps illuminate what I regard to be their deliberate embrace of alterity. She explains that Bell, that is, explains that ritualization succeeds in constructing relationships of power, in reinscribing hegemonic order through the setting up of binary oppositions, that ritual participation naturalizes and inscribes on the individual. The opposition that ritualizing creates, however, are rarely balanced. Bell notes, binary pairs such as right-left, up-down, male-female, good-evil are homologized in such a way as to subordinate one side of the pair to the other. Furthermore, the analogizing of one set of pairs to another generates complex chains of associations and taxonomic relations that serve to reinscribe on the individual body the naturalness of these social categories. Thus, we frequently see homologizing of darkness, danger, femininity, and impurity on one side, which are positioned in opposition or subordinate to light, protection, masculine virtues, and purity on the other side. Ritualization, according to Bell, reinforces the naturalness of these associations and inscribes them into the social and individual body through participation in movements and actions such as washing, bowing, kneeling, separation of the sexes, veiling, unveiling, sacrificing, etc. And these make up the habitus, to borrow a term from Pierre Bourdieu, formed through ritual action, spatial navigation, and encounters with hierarchical power. Drawing on Bell's understanding of ritualization as actions that operate within a signifying system of binary operations, I suggest that rituals regarded as magic, specifically defixiones, deliberately and self-consciously embrace the lesser, the subordinate of these ritually constructed binary pairs. Not all rituals that involve inversion, however, constitute magic. It is well observed that nearly all cultures have certain festivals, holidays, or celebrations that involve transgressing social boundaries, inverting social hierarchy, and otherwise flouting normally observed mores or taboos. These practices constitute part of a socially sanctioned and recognized period of communitas, or the liminality that accompanies a change in social status, where power is drawn from symbolic inversion. Unlike these socially sanctioned rituals that allow for a temporary release of tension and serve ultimately to reaffirm the status quo, defixiones engage in ritualized actions drawn from the subordinate side of the binary operation. In so doing, I want to explore whether they challenge the existing hegemonic discourse and their supporting taxonomies. Bruce Lincoln writes that, quote, ritual is best understood as an authoritative mode of symbolic discourse and a powerful instrument for the evocation of those sentiments, affinity and estrangement, out of which society is constructed. Concomitantly, practices that deliberately invert or violate a society's symbolic discourse, expressed through its myths and rituals, subvert the discursive structures upon which its regimes of power rest. Potentially, they aim to subvert society itself, or at least its allocation of power and authority. Such inversions can be seen, for example, in antinomian acts, like the iconoclastic exhumation of sacred internments that exposed deceased monks and nuns to public scrutiny during the Spanish Civil War. Can we see something comparable happening in ritual curses that proliferated across the Roman Empire during Antiquity? Second half, sip of tea. Okay, so moving on to material evidence for lived religion. So my theorizing, reflecting the original paper I presented 20 years ago, seems somewhat out of step with current studies that situate these rituals within a broader approach to understanding ancient history through the lens of lived religion. Defixiones are no longer treated as relics of an irrational, superstitious underclass, or as aberrant acts of ritual deviance, but are integrated into a holistic approach to studying ancient societies that focuses on material evidence for the local, the specific, and the prosaic. Lauren Nasrallah's new book, Early Christians and the Power of Cursing, explicitly connects the ritual actions, aesthetics, and legal logic of ancient defixiones to their contemporary context. She writes, defixiones are an underutilized source for the investigation of ideas of agency, the will, and the efficacy of humans and non-human subjects, whether gods or the materiality of the lead on which a defixio is incised. We should attend as seriously to a defixio as we would a treatise by Plutarch or a letter of Paul. We should investigate the context of literary and archaeological materials without trying to taxonomize them into right religious versus malicious magic. Esther Eidenau's landmark book, Oracles, Curses, and Risk Among the Ancient Greeks, position curses alongside oracles as rational strategies to mitigate risk. In so doing, she broke down the disciplinary dichotomy between official religious and cultural productions of elite men and the superstitious practices of marginalized groups, such as prostitutes tavern keepers, actors, and slaves, which was largely ignored as irrelevant by classical historians. By considering both practices through the anthropological lens of risk management, her analysis brings human psychology and emotion into focus, contributing to the affective turn in classical and religious studies. David Frankfurter's influential chapter, Ancient Magic in a New Key, challenges theologically laden definitions of magic that seek to maintain boundaries between pure religion, especially early Christianity, and the aberrant practices of marginal others. Using the term magic to label ritual objects or corpora such as the PGM, Frankfurter argues, prejudges their status in society, relegating them to the margins when in fact they derive from contexts coterminous with officially recognized religious practitioners and institutions, such as Egyptian temples and their Hellenized priests, in the case of PGM, churches and monasteries in the pastoral activity of writing amulets for the laity, or rabbis in the production of incantation bowls to trap demons. Contributing to the material turn in religious studies, contributing to the material turn in religious studies, Frankfurter focuses on, quote, the element of agency and presence in objects sought out, combined, crafted, invested with mediation, deposited, worn, or placed publicly. He sees the curse tablet sent to Hecate by way of a grave as equivalent to the female figurine left in a saint's shrine. It is the agency in the material object that is felt to protect, communicate, heal, or curse. Even while they emphasize continuity with other social domains, all three of these scholars identify a latent subversiveness or alterity present in binding spells that contribute to their classification as magic. This is where I want to re-enter the conversation by considering the ritualization of defixiones as active participation in and construction of magic discourse. Idenau draws on Bell's conception of ritualization to interpret Libanius's response to experiencing a magic attack as an expression of agency. Through his ritualized actions, he participates in the construction of magic belief. She cogently writes, it was the ritualized and embodied interrelationship of individual and society that generated continually the perceived presence of the supernatural and belief in the power of magic. In a broader sense, Libanius's ritualized agency reaffirmed the local social hierarchy by identifying the curse against him as threatening, antisocial, and abject. How else to describe the mutilated chameleon that channeled supernatural harm toward him? The magic was illicit and socially disruptive in his eyes because it interrupted the rightful flow of honor and status to him earned for his academic achievements and proficiency. In what follows, I propose that just as Libanius understood the cultural language and appropriate response to magical attack, defixiones play the other side of that social script by embracing certain features of magic discourse to construct magic's alterity. Like Libanius, ritual experts understood the socially constructed belief in magic and participated in it. Only they did so by flipping the script and harnessing the abject power of the other side of the ritualized binary system. Okay, so ritual defixiones, enacting alterity and subverting social hierarchy. I'm not a Derrida scholar by any means, but the practice of inverting the apparently stable semantic binary on which social hierarchy and the status quo derive their legitimacy seems apt when considering the discursive function of alterity in many curses. Laura Nasrallah's haunting and eye-opening discussion of the judicial curses pinned to a dank wall in a shaft that was likely the mass grave for victims of state-sanctioned violence, specifically victims of crucifixion and decapitation, reveals both the continuity of these curses with judicial practices, such as posting legal petitions, and their otherness. Nasrallah enlists Ashon Crawley's principle of otherwise possibility to consider ancient curses because sometimes, she writes, phenomena classified as magic did represent an alterity in antiquity. They were seen as politically deviant, as dangerous in their ability to rout the normal order of things. Nasrallah leads us to think deeply about the petitioners on these spells who enlisted ritual experts, probably from a local shrine, to mitigate risks in a judicial case by constraining their opponents. She also asks about the further injustice inflicted on the souls of the executed who were being exploited by the ritual invocation. Is it possible that the souls of the violently dead may themselves have been executed because of a miscarriage of justice? Could they be sympathetic to the petition of someone facing a lying witness or a wealthy patron who could buy off the local judge? Was there a social rapprochement between victims of injustice already dead and those who sought to prevent their own execution in an unjust court? When we view these judicial curses strictly from the position of Roman law and sanctioned ritual, they appear deviant, abject for invoking the impure souls of executed criminals. When we consider them from the other side, their ritualizing of alterity may be a strategic discursive act of defiance and empowerment. They express agency and participate in the construction of magic discourse through a ritualizing act, but draw from the opposite side of the social script than Libanius does. I turn now to consider Frankfurter's singular investigation into the bizarre case of fetus magic. Frankfurter describes the case of an elite young farmer in 2nd century CE Egypt, Gemellus Orion, who made a formal complaint to the Roman strategos, in which he detailed the outrages committed against him by his neighbors. He accused them of taking the harvest from his fields twice, and then marching out in broad daylight and launching a brephos, or fetus, at his harvesters. The brephos, according to his account, played some role in a binding spell that, quote, surrounded them with malice. So phthonoi periklise, permitting him to steal the harvest unmolested. Gemellus Horion then claims they retrieved the brephos and launched it a second time at a group of village elders, who presumably served as witnesses to this assault. Frankfurter unpacks this bizarre story in order to understand the social context and magical use of a fetus in Roman Egypt. In his investigation, Frankfurter discovers that the same archive from Kuranes holds other petitions and complaints from the same Gemellus Horion, revealing his inclination toward litigious solutions to social conflicts. These petitions also indicate that Gemellus Horion was the descendant of an army veteran who had been granted citizenship and thus belonged to an elite social rank, which he emphasizes in his petition. The archive contains another charge against this same neighbor, Julius, for violently entering his fields earlier that same spring. He also vaguely charges that Julius held power, dynamis, in the area although the type of power is not specified. Frankfurter assimilates this malevolent use of a fetus to constrain Gemellus Horion and his harvesters to ancient defixiones and katadesmoi, interpreting it as a ritual act of binding. He then investigates precedent for the ritual use of a fetus to bind or harm someone. While the PGM include recipes and instructions for rituals that use a wide variety of seemingly bizarre and noxious ingredients, more on that later, they do not specify using a fetus. Frankfurter does uncover archaeological evidence for a 14-week-old fetus that was found buried in the debris of a 4th century house in the Dakhla oasis. This fetus would have been concealed in the archaeological report speculates. The fetus was wrapped in a linen cloth and a long cord, as you can see from the picture. The archaeological record speculates that the fetus would have been concealed in the house's roof. The article continues to consider whether this fetus was aborted or miscarried, and to discuss the different burial methods for infants depending on whether they were wanted and recognized by the family or not. Frankfurter speculates from the wrapping method that this fetus may have served as a power object, with possible parallels to the one Julius threw at the harvesters and elders in Koranus. My interest, for the purposes of this presentation, follows Frankfurter's discussion of the brephos's possible impurity and contagion. While fetuses that die naturally do not carry ritual impurity and were often buried intramurally, those that lost social recognition could be disposed of as waste, as indicated by the discovery of neonate skeletons in a sewer in Roman Ashkelon. Thus, Frankfurter concludes, while mourned corpses of any age belong in tombs or even domestic walls, prenate or neonate corpses without pre-accepted status are deemed waste, which, as it were, belongs properly in a sewer. This provides two avenues for interpreting the ritual power of the brephos launched in Koranus. If it was an unrecognized fetus, then like all corpses in human waste, it was, quote, an object of gross impurity, according to Frankfurter. If it was a pre-accepted fetus, mistreated by the ritual use of its body, one would expect to incur the wrath of an Aoros. In either case, Frankfurter concludes, launching a brephos to maliciously bind someone can be understood with reference to Malinowski's coefficient of weirdness. Quoting Frankfurter here, the coefficient of weirdness refers to words, objects, and forms that stand apart from classifiable communication, that resist and even threaten coherence, and that thereby distinguish ritual materials or speech as otherworldly and powerfully ambivalent. In the terms we've been discussing today, it signifies alterity. Frankfurter concludes that the fetus hurled by Julius as part of an act of magical aggression was effective in its ability to paralyze its targets with fear. He asks why Gemellus Horion did not respond with countermagic, a protective amulet, or prayer, as Ida now notes that Libanius did. Why did he go to the Roman strategos to file a formal legal complaint? This leads us back to the questions raised by Laura Nasrallah's study of judicial curses buried with the victims of Roman judicial violence. It would seem that due to his high social status and apparent proclivity to file lawsuits, this Gemellus Horion felt comfortable in his element in a Roman court of law. What about Julius? We do not know his status, and despite Horion's claim that he wielded power in the area, we might presume that Julius is a social inferior to Gemellus Horion, and possibly lacked social or economic resources to pursue justice in a Roman court. This possibility emerges from another document in the archive that shows Julius serving as Horion's tenant farmer. Is it possible that he was a poor farmer whose land was unfairly acquired by Gemellus Horion? Maybe Julius regarded the fields and harvest in question to rightfully be his own, and maybe he resorted to using a brephos to protect himself from unfair land acquisition or boundary violation at the hands of Gemellus. Could a complete version of the social script reveal the ritual use of a polluting substance to protect and defend a social inferior who felt unfairly treated by the litigious Gemellus Horion, who may have had friends in high places. Following Nasrallah's lead, when we take these rituals seriously and try to understand them according to their own internal logic, aesthetics, and ethics, we reveal a different story, an otherwise possibility, in the words of Crawley, one that embraces alterity as a way to express agency and access power. In so doing, these rituals participate in the discourse of magic, but do so with an iconoclasm that undermines the symbolic system underpinning Roman social hierarchies. They may be micro-level acts of defiance and revolution. Finally, actually, I'm going to have another water here. Finally, I turn to the PGM and evidence in that corpus for deliberate embrace of alterity. Alan Siegel's groundbreaking 1981 article, Hellenistic Magic, Some Questions of Definition, identified the presence of prayers, hymns, and initiations in the magical papyri that called into question the firm dichotomy between magic and religion. Since then, scholars, particularly David Frankfurter, have illuminated the origin of that corpus among Hellenized Egyptian priests who participated in strategic acts of stereotype appropriation to market their ritual expertise. In this context of colonial hybridity, economic competition, and reverence for ancient religious wisdom, Frankfurter argues that Egyptian priests increasingly adapted rituals to suit a client base that desired and expected something of the exotic power of the Persian Magoi. Yet this self-promotion as international magos above and beyond other priestly roles like festive leadership festive leadership or care of images was not simply an invention of or capitulation to the wider Roman world's exoticism. It also reflected the idealization of priests in native Egyptian literature, as this literature was still being composed in both Egyptian and Greek during the early Roman period. This divided identity and hybrid role may explain some of the ambivalence toward alterity that appears in the PGM. Kyle Fraser has argued that, in truth, the process of appropriation was strategic. Even as the priestly magicians accepted their role as masters of malign magic, they continued to envision themselves as pure custodians of the sacred wisdom of the temples. The PGM exhibit features of self-conscious alterity that warrant discussion. The first I will discuss. There's lots, but so the first I will discuss is a list of coded ingredients in PGM 12, 401 to 44. And this follows the prize and dance numbering. So this list identifies the prosaic herb or other item behind exotic and often noxious sounding ingredients required in the recipes. According to this list, which was kept secret from the masses to prevent them from practicing magic, since they did not take precaution, apparently, a snake's head is actually leech. Bone of an ibis is buckthorn. Blood of Hephaestus is wormwood. A man's bile is turnip sap, etc. Without this translation of coded ingredients, the rituals in PGM appear far more exotic and impossible to effect than they apparently were in reality. Using coded ingredients thus served both to publicly project an image of exotic power to clients, conforming to stereotypes, while providing evidence that the alterity is merely superficial, part of a smoke and mirrors game with clients and non-initiates. Yet other rituals in the PGM apparently require ingredients that are actually aberrant, polluting, and abject, such as PGM 4, 1872 to 1927, which purports to be a powerful binding spell that involves placing a bone from the head of a man who's died violently in a dog's mouth and inscribing on the sides of the dog with special characters that conjure numinous power. The ritual proceeds to invoke the souls of those who have hanged themselves or died violently to attract a woman to the supplicant immediately, quickly. Laura Nasrallah aptly identifies rape as the objective of many amatory or attraction spells and encourages scholars to name them as such. She also proposes that many binding spells targeting men may aim to prevent rape, highlighting again the power imbalance that many defixiones sought to redress. Another spell for divination, PGM 4, 2145 to 2240, involves attaching the tablet and a lodestone to a criminal who's been executed, speaking verses in his ear so he will tell you everything you wish. You can also derive good luck and honor from superiors and masters if you insert the lamella into his wound, and it protects against daimones and wild animals. While the manipulation of ba-O-thanaton, or thanatoi, plural, was a well-known technology in ancient defixiones and has been explained rationally in a variety of ways, this spell also evokes images of Erichtho's necromantic rite and Lucan's Pharsalia, suggesting an overlap between art and life that points less to the veracity of literary depictions than it suggests ritual imitation of powerful fiction. Do we have a case of art imitating life or life imitating art? This intersection of ritual practice and narrative imagination underscores the participatory nature of discourse as knowledge power flows bidirectionally in the construction and perpetuation of magic discourse. Whether the alterity of rituals in PGM is actual or merely performative, it suggests the operation of a subversive discourse. Applying Bell's theory of ritualization, these recipes enlist actions and ingredients that consistently belong to the lesser or subordinate side of the symbolic binary that defined Roman religion and cultic mores. In so doing, they reveal the contingent construction of power that Roman law sought to enforce. In other words, it permitted an active and participatory reimagining of Roman hierarchy that did not privilege inherited power and elite status, but offered agency to those who are often denied access to justice, bodily integrity, and dignity. Conclusion. So in this presentation, I've tried to theorize, in terms of ritualization, the alterity that is a consistent feature of defixiones. In so doing, I do not intend to reinscribe the religion magic binary that defined earlier studies and has appropriately been superseded by the current focus on materiality of lived religion, which situates these rituals within the rich social context and embodied lives of regular people in the ancient Mediterranean. Instead, I hope this heuristic can illuminate the ideological work of these rituals as modes of symbolic action. Such an approach is advanced not as a corrective to the current methods, but as a complement to them, which can bring the aspect of personal agency and social redress into sharper relief. I look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that very interesting talk. And I know there's probably a lot of questions out there. I have questions of my own, but I will leave it up to others to start the conversation.
Did I stop sharing? Stop sharing. There we go.
Are there any questions? Okay. I guess if there aren't any questions, I would like to maybe ask.
So no questions. I see Andrew Durden's in the audience. So Andrew, since I called out your book, which is not yet published,
First. Yeah.
but well with the read, wondering if
Yeah, I got a question. Sure.
sure.
Um, so there's this piece that Bernd Christian Otto wrote for Newman. I think it's back in 2013. And there's a footnote where he talks about he distinguishes his work from yours when thinking about, magic as a label.
I
And
don't think I've read that one.
yeah, well, I think it's an English distillation of this much larger German book, which is based on, dissertation, things like
Mhm.
that. Much more accessible to, if you don't want to read 1,000 pages of German,
In
which is,
German.
um, so, and it was, he makes this distinction between, in his footnote, between your work and his, and he says where, Kimberly Stratton wants to say that magic is a sort of discourse in some sort of ideational sense.
Mhm.
He wants to argue that magia and related sort of word clusters were themselves systems and subsystems of larger discourses of sort of deviance and alterity and things like that.
Mhm.
And he goes on to say that that's a relatively minor distinction. And then in my book that you cited, I actually make a lot out of that.
Mhm.
So I was curious what you might how you might reflect on that sort of difference in his articulation of your view of magic as a discourse versus something like magia and other sorts of nomenclature for alterity and deviance as subsumed in other sorts of discourses, ramified across ancient life, discourse, things like that.
Well, I haven't read his thing. You just mentioned that to me, but I did read your book, and so I don't think it's wrong. I think it's fine. Like I don't feel like it's an either or. I feel like you could have a kind of larger cluster of notions that reinforce each other, work together, and still have sub ideas, if that makes sense. So as I was kind of mulling over your book, I was thinking about, say, racism as a kind of discourse, right? And so you could say, well, you've got, redrawing of voting maps. You've got, maybe movies or television shows depicting, racialized groups in a particular way. And you might say, those are different domains. True, and each one, operates kind of separately, but also participates kind of in a larger overall kind of discourse, right, of racism, if that makes sense, in terms of kind of power structure and ideas. Maybe racism isn't the best, it's kind of a loaded example, but it came to mind um, reading current news and the redrawing of voting maps and voting districts. But I was thinking about how they can say, oh, this has nothing to do with race, and yet it has everything to do with race, right? And so even when, because I noticed in your book you were pointing out like, oh, they don't mention Megea here, so therefore it's not Megea. Well, yeah, but in other places, they're aware the Megea, is being used interchangeably with pharmakeia or with something else. And so they might use one term and not another. They draw on the stereotype and they're indicating it's like that the tip of an iceberg. They're kind of pointing to the larger kind of complex intellectual aggregate, however you might want to describe it. So I am splitting hairs. I don't know. I mean, I mean, I think it's a valid point, but I don't know if it means that you can't talk about magic discourse as this kind of larger operative constellation.
And I think all that detail you
Yeah.
brought out in your talk is really, really great. And I think I want to support ways of theorizing and talking that help bring that out. And I think that's where I'm suspicious of that magic is kind of a blunt instrument. Um, but again, I mean, I don't just, I leave open the possibility that under certain stipulative ways of defining it, it'd be perfectly fine. But again, all that beautiful detail you brought out, and I need to read Laura Nasralda's book. It's really sort of a crime I
Oh,
have.
it's lovely. She just
Yeah.
writes so beautifully, and it's
Yeah.
just yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So it was really interesting. I quite enjoyed that.
Kind of going back to this idea of I mean, so I think in my book, the chapter, like I talk about Megea or, magic discourse is kind of a broader, as I said, kind of constellation. But then I mean, you can always do more, but I mean, in each chapter, I tried to go into the local, right, and the specific, and really drill down into, the dynamics in individual texts and or accusations, or, to really contextualize things and avoid overgeneralizing. And I think also you have to kind of, like, every piece of scholarship enters into a conversation at a particular moment. So at that time, 20 years ago, the conversation was, magic as a thing. It's like, is there magic? Do people do magic, or is there just religion and nobody's doing magic? And I'm kind of like, well, no, actually, I think you can think about magic, but it's not just out there, right? It's not like this is magic. I can pick up a mug and be like, it's lovely, my magic-y mug. People obviously know my interests here. So you're like, oh, this is clearly evidence for magic. No, I mean, what is it? We can, look at this with God, moons and a little hand that invokes for us an idea of a palm reader or astrology or something, and that buys into a constellation of magic ideas. And so is this mug just a mug, or is this mug part of magic discourse because of the associations we bring to it, right? So it's trying to show the way in which we participate in the constructing of the idea. So magic isn't out there that we can just go like an anthropologist and just show up somewhere and say, oh, here it is, I found it, that's magic. No, it's being constructed in every society, and they do it differently. As David Frankfurt has pointed out, most cultures have some idea of ritual alterity that plays out in different ways. So I was really trying to focus on the historical kind of, I don't know, construction, maybe too, I don't know, concrete, but the kind of idea as it worked itself out across 4 different examples in ancient Western antiquity. Looking back on it, though, I think my main criticism of my book was trying too hard to pin down specific social situations that kind of produce, like trying to really narrow it down and kind of pinpoint, like, oh, here's when this happened. But on the other hand, I do think you can, to a certain extent, like we could say, since COVID, there's, vaccine suspicion or anti-vax movement, or, populism's on the rise. So if you're a historian looking back 2,000 years from now, you might go back and be like, oh, these ideas were circulating, and then, they got a big push from this crisis, this thing that happened. So I think that's kind of what I was trying to do. And again, entering into conversation with, other scholars at that moment. And so.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking more about this with you at some point, but I want to hear what David has to say.
Yes, me too.
David, why don't you go ahead and read your question?
Oh, okay. Here I am. Okay, you can hear me. Okay. So, Kim, we've been talking about this for a very long time.
We have.
And
it's because in Venice you told me to revisit this that I did.
Well, I think that everyone agrees that there is a rhetoric of alterity, and that is ritualized, and I think that for a lot of us, or me, for example, but I think for some time, it seemed more useful to treat this as a verbal, to go back to Bell, a ritualization of speech as opposed to a discourse of political action. And that the problem with looking at the discourse of alterity or ritual alterity as serving justice and serving revolutionary activity is it works until it doesn't. And this is my problem with Laura's book as well. You can cast all of these defixiones as kind of intimations towards justice and compare them to African-American art of justice and things like that. And then you get to some horrendous erotic spell which talks about some nice woman who's happily married being dragged out of the house by her hair. And you're thinking like, okay, yeah, it's a justice because the person feels like he really ought to be married to her rather than someone else. And same thing with other forms of curses and defixiones, that you can hope that they're all using rhetorics of alterity to secure justice in an imperial system, but half the time, and actually I think this is where Libanius is a good example, contra Esther's article. Libanius is exploiting magic discourse for his own elite position. So, I don't know. I feel like at the end of the day that we agree that there is this discourse, there is symbolic inversion, there are notions of impurity and how you can use those ritually and imaginatively to discuss or to secure power. There is a coefficient of weirdness, which I think is an incredibly useful topic, but that these can be used by anybody in any class to create ritual power. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And then we kind of get, I think maybe, I assume Laura, myself, you tread carefully on that because then you start to fall into the, well, magic's aberrant, deviant, serving selfish ends. You kind of fall into that old dichotomy. But for sure, I mean, presumably the person who did magic against Libanius was also an elite rhetor, part of that world and not some kind of underclass slave or something. So I don't want to overdraw that. Although I do, and here's a shout out to Drew again, I'm clearly a big fan of Bruce Lincoln and, this idea of kind of I think, Drew, didn't you have the quotation in the preface of your book that, what was it, that scholarship is political, something like that you were.
Oh yeah, that was in my acknowledgments to Bruce. Yeah.
To Bruce. Yeah. And I think that, kind of, I may be, channeling a bit too much of the, trying to sort of make it political, find it political, use this as my own soapbox for, the underclass or something. Anyway, no, but I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, that's a good point. So you don't want to overstate that. But I think it's important, though, to kind of, again, as this counterbalance to the, magic is, selfish and antisocial, and to kind of show where, well, maybe not. Again, like with the case of the brevice, we don't know the relative status, but seeing Gemellus Horion as the victim, well, maybe he was victimizing Julius. We won't know, but kind of thinking about how, it occurred to me, like, maybe it was the point that, he was then the tenant farmer. I'm like, oh, well, he's clearly not elite if he's a tenant farmer. So you may find that the elite person is using their social influence to dominate somebody else. And this is their only recourse. And a longer version of this, that bring in James C. Scott and, hidden discourses and, or hidden transcripts, and, this kind of idea, the weapons of the weak. I mean, there's a lot to do here. It's all quite old, I realized. It's so dated, but maybe it's kind of like jeans. It's like you could have recycled theory from 20 years ago and it's back in fashion. It's like, so I find that with my closet, if I hang something up, I pull it out 20 years ago, right? And I'm like, oh, this is what my students are wearing, So it's sort of like file away a paper from 20 years ago and dust it off and you're like, back in fashion. I don't know. But I mean, that was kind of my concern writing this. I was thinking, well, maybe the conversation's just moved on and all of this, post-structuralism, postmodern discourse stuff has just kind of had its time already and we've moved on. I don't know. So that was a doubt I had when I was writing it.
Can I just suggest as a refinement that when magic, when ritual alterity is used as a weapons of the in some conflict situation, there is probably a difference in performance between when it is used by the elite and when it is used by the underclass, by the subaltern. And that you may be right about Gemellus Horion and the other guy and Julius, and it's a really interesting thing. But then I think that there are nuances there that can be explored about what happens when the elite is using both accusations of sorcery and also practices of sorcery.
No, for sure. That's really interesting. And it's calling to mind, one of the things in James C. Scott's book about apocalyptic, right? And the use of apocalypse an apocalyptic language by the underclass. And I was thinking, well, what happens when you have someone like Pete Hegseth, and the current administration using these same tropes and this language of victimhood and an apocalypse to, legitimize, military attacks, right, and war. So I think 100%, like there's a different, I don't know, sort of social valence. I don't even know what the word. Obviously, yes, it's a totally different thing when the weapons of the weak are appropriated by the elite, and vice versa, right? So yeah, thanks for that. Nice to see you, by the way.
On that point, Kim, if I may ask a question about the relationship between kind of the objects that we call magical and notions of alterity. It seems to me that these kinds of objects cross multiple layers of alterity, not like a powerful, non-powerful dichotomy, in the sense that many objects that themselves are being condemned for being Megea condemn other practitioners.
Yes.
They hit down. Right? In other words, a lot of the objects hit down. They're not necessarily fighting against power. And so there seems to be that there's multiple kind of layers of alterity, because certain ritual experts in certain contexts might be seen as appropriate or inappropriate depending upon the context, as well as certain groups. Jews, for example, you might highlight them for an exoticized thing, but then you can also condemn them and highlight their evils, etc. Right? So it seems to me like the ways in which the objects we call magical, and I think in this regard, the dichotomy or the separation of amulets from curses. I mean, I do think that there could be heuristic utility in doing that, but there also oftentimes is an imprecatory dimension to many amulets, right? They help to deflect the magic of the person put on you back onto them, right? And there's a tremendous amount of aggression that's embedded into amuletic texts as well. And so it seems to me that maybe the issue of alterity needs to be kind of complicated in this regard, because it's happening at multiple levels. It's not just power, non-power. That power is being constructed at multiple.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's right. And there's sort of, unfortunately, on the cutting room floor, because I just ran out of time and space, I wanted to engage your discussion of the talisman that's also a prayer, and that whole kind of way in which you use that example to discuss this very thing about alterity and who's labeling who magic and how do they identify their own practices. Anyways, in a longer version, if I pursue it, then I want to get into that and other questions, like David's discussion of cursing, right? So, that's sort of the cursing blessing, and that sometimes curses, are part of a blessing, right? In a way, you're trying to protect and create order by constraining the forces of chaos. And so it's much more complicated, obviously, than I'm kind of able to draw in a paper of this length and size. But it's all kind of there floating around these conversations. But I think you're 100% right. And again, you've got, the subgroups and subcultures, right? Of so what does it mean when Christians are accusing others of magic when they're the ones who are practicing the much more aberrant and weird religion, within a larger Roman context, at least initially. And
it'd be interesting to see the differences across the kind of Jewish, Christian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian divides, if you will, and how these kind of dynamics are taking place in these different contexts, in a Jewish context, in which amulets, for example, are not necessarily deviant.
No, not at all. No, not at all.
And Christian context, right? So then even the notion of deviancy changes.
Yeah, no, exactly. So amulets, if they're proven to work, are regarded as bona fide, right? I mean, they're not. It was a medical technology, right? It wasn't considered magical. So that's why I feel like we have to be really careful. The emig versus edict, and how we're, was this magic part of magic discourse in the ancient world, or is that something we're imposing because we're treating it according to the sort of science versus superstition kind of binary, and we're importing that idea, or is it something that they themselves would have identified. So I try to stick with something that's more clear cut, like defixiones, because I'm like, yeah, I think everybody kind of agreed those were magic. Whereas when we start to talk about amulets, healing charms, mini codices, things like that people might, in the scholarly kind of, disciplinary binning, throw into, the bucket labeled magic, but an ancient person wouldn't have conceived of it as magic.
Well, church fathers condemn, for example, phylacteria as chains of the soul that you should be excommunicated for them.
That's right. And then of course it changes. And again, you've got, which culture where. So all of this, you've got, the local, the micro, the specific case study, versus kind of zooming out to these larger heuristics. And so one question, because I know the trend has been toward the micro histories, right? And the close readings and the focus on the material, and an eschewing of these kinds of grand meta narratives that are trying to create a heuristic. I tend to think that way. I mean, that tends to be how my mind works, as I kind of start with seeing a pattern and then thinking, theorizing what I see, and then I work down. I'm a forest person, other scholars are tree people. And so I think, there's trees in the forest, we got to work together. I don't know.
No. I think it's great. I think it was a very interesting paper, really intriguing on multiple levels. So I think we all learned a tremendous amount for it. Any final questions before we close this session? Let me just thank again Kim for a very interesting paper. It was great, well received, and everybody's. I think maybe it's being received a little bit better in this particular day and age than 20 years ago, because I do think that there's a lot that you're grappling with and the complexity of the theories that we're seeing play out in other domains of late antique studies.
I think also because my book literally had just come out, like I think it had been published just, right in time for SBL. So it came out in November and this talk was in January. So I don't think anybody had read it. And this idea of discourse had any time to kind of penetrate the field at all. And I think that when I think back, and knowing kind of the orientation of people like Chris Farone, especially at that time, where they were really invested in saying there is no magic, this is all religion, and trying to kind of recuperate magic from this bin of discarded, the refuse of ancient society. And I think that when I'm talking about it as being subversive, it was registering on his radar and everybody's radar at that time as reinforcing that magic religion dichotomy. And so now I think, it's a different conversation now. And new information and new ways of thinking about it. So it's said older and wiser.
That's right. So again, thank you, Kim, for that. And thank you everyone for coming and participating in this conversation and in this lecture series in general. This is the final one we have for this lecture series, at least for this year. But again, as Pierre had mentioned at the beginning, we will put these on the Center for the Study of Lived Religions website. And these are, again, a wide range of topics that we've covered, everything from drug usage in Brazil to American Mexico relations, to ancient Egypt, to theoretical discussions on magic. So we've covered quite a bit on this, and the idea was precisely to be as global and cross-cultural as possible. So I encourage you to go onto the site of the center, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. So once again, Kim, thank you very much. It's great.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you very much. Thank you.